Hello and welcome to this fifth lecture, the last lecture of the first week lecture series on the SWAYAM course titled Aspects of Cultural Studies. The title of this lecture fifth is Cultural Studies and its Keywords. We have already spoken on certain keywords, key terminologies in our previous lecture, that is lecture 4, and in this lecture 5 we will continue with explications of some more keywords that we come across when we study cultural studies or when we try to understand what cultural studies is. So, the objective of this lecture is basically to acquaint students with some of the key vocabularies or the building blocks of cultural studies and to make them understand why and how these cultural studies terminologies are significant. In this lecture, we will discuss keywords like culture, which is the crux of cultural studies, keywords like popular culture, mass culture, high culture, keywords like class, working class, class consciousness, keywords like representations and public space or kinds of public spaces. These are the some of the keywords that we will try to understand through slides in this lecture. We have already spoken about the importance of keywords as has already been described by Raymond Williams in his book Culture and Society, particularly in the keyword sections which had 110 keywords and which was obviously published in 1976 as keywords of vocabulary of culture and society. Again in 1983 some more words were included, and again in 2005 we have a new version of keywords which is called New Keywords : Revised Vocabulary of Culture and Society, published by edited by Tony Bennett and Lawrence Grossberg et al. So, I will take you to the first slide of this lecture. So, to begin with, we need to understand phenomenology to understand cultural studies. In the very first lecture, I had elaborated on how phenomenology was one of the first traditions or formations or schools of thought that the cultural studies schools in Frankfurt as well as in Birmingham would follow. So, therefore, we need to understand phenomenology as a key component of cultural studies. So, what is this phenomenology? Phenomenology is, as Edmund Husserl talks about, is about perception of reality while applying or directing our thoughts onto the object. They do not accept the pre-existence of an object. For them, an object exists because of our application of intentionality onto the object. So, therefore, intentionality is central in making meaning of reality. And in cultural studies, as you understand, meaning is not given, fixed, defined in a structure. Meaning in cultural studies is derived by different readers from different texts only through the application of our intentionality. So, it is our structures of experiences in different times, different contexts, for different objects, different texts. So, these structures of experiences define the meaning of a culture or meaning of any text or any object. So, this is how phenomenology is central to the study of cultural studies. Now, as you can see on your screen, Edmund Husserl talks about this intentionality, logic of investigations, and he talks about bracketing. What is bracketing? Bracketing is removing all pre-existing ideas about an object, suspending one's beliefs concerning the pre-existence of the perceptual objects. Objects which are to be perceived should not be perceived with some kind of presuppositions or some kind of pre-existing ideas or conceptions, in order to focus on their intrinsic properties or essences. So, that is how phenomenology is central to the understanding of cultural studies. And you would remember how we talk about intertextuality. Julia Kristeva talks about in her 1964 article. And we talk about metatext, peritext, epitext, hypertext. Gerard Zenet in 1982 book Palimpsests talks about. And we also know how Bakhtin was talking about polyphony, heteroglossia, particularly his dialogy, semantic dialogic between words, meaning or signs. So, this is called semiotics, and all these would emerged having a phenomenological approach to reality or object or text. So, reality is not about what is existing or which can be defined through experimentations, through proofs, through empiricism, through rational mind or logic. Reality is also part of our intuition, of our thoughts, of our ideas, of our dreams, of our emotions, as well as our actions. So, that is how this post-structuralism, post-modernism, all these new schools of thoughts, new approaches to studies would invariably have connections with phenomenology. Well, I was talking about metatext. You had not only different kinds of texts, you had different kinds of readers also. So, you have implied reader, you had super reader, you had informed reader, you had psychological reader. You know, Wolfgang Iser and Roman Ingarden, Stanley Fish, Rolla Barthes, they would all talk about different kinds of readers and texts. Stanley Fish would talk about in the 1980 article, is there a text in this class? Or Rolla Barthes would talk about the death of the author. So, these were all, you can see the contributions of the impact of influence of phenomenology. So, culture then becomes a text for decoding different meanings, or text then is not the text of the author, but the text of the perceivers or the readers. So, we can look at a particular text differently. So, different people have different ideas, and together all these shifting meanings make a new culture. So, there is not, you do not have one culture, but there are many cultures. We talk of high culture, low culture, popular culture, mass culture, because there are different categories, different kinds of culture making people and culture perceiving or reading people also. So, phenomenology then becomes one significant vocabulary of cultural studies. So, let me take you culture. Now, this is how Raymond Williams defines culture. He says culture has two aspects. One is the known meanings and direction, the already existing, and the other one is the new observations and meanings. In other words, culture is traditional, what has been existing, and culture is also creative, which is being created either afresh or as a reaction or as a response or as a result of the traditional ones. And Williams tells that culture is both most ordinary common meanings as the society or societies have been deriving their meanings, or the finest individual meanings that are there. So, he tells, we use word culture in these two senses, in the traditional sense and in the creative evolving sense, dynamic sense. And we mean two senses, to mean a whole way of life, the common meanings, generalization of culture, and also to mean the arts and the learning, that is the special process of discovery and creative effort. The culture is not static, culture is static, what is given, and culture is also addition to the past existing one, the new creations. This is what culture is. Let us say, for example, when you understand pen, obviously we understand pen like this traditional fountain pen, and after fountain pen you have this ball pen, and now I have this pen which is digital in nature. So, culture means this as well as this. T.S. Eliot also talks about tradition and individual talent, but Eliot would be criticized for different reason, for his elitist version like Matthew Arnold and F.R. Leavis version of culture. But nevertheless, like Raymond Williams, T.S. Eliot would also emphasize on a holistic, inclusive view of culture. So, this is how Raymond Williams defines culture. Now, we will discuss high culture, mass culture and popular culture. Primarily mass culture and popular culture are almost used synonymously, but high culture means the culture of the elites, the cognitively superior people, those who have high intelligence, rationality, logic, and very rational and modern version of civilization, they are called high culture. Let us say, for example, culture of the educated elites, the intellectuals, or the economically affluent people, pretentiously to be intelligent and more rational and logical. So, that is called high culture. And as against this high culture, you have another kind of culture which has evolved over the times, particularly with urbanization, with industrialization, with globalization, and with mass media, communication and computer as well. That is how culture is evolving, culture is evolutionary in nature or dynamic in nature. So, you have popular culture as against the high culture. It is like bourgeois and the proletariat, the elites and the common people. And E.P. Thompson, even Raymond Williams, both of them, they crossed that hierarchical boundary between high culture and the low culture or the mass culture or popular culture, and they go into the lowest level, the common people, the subalterns. So E.P. Thompson is known for writing history from below, like the subaltern group, talking about the historiography of the peasants, of the subalterns. So, popular culture is an opposite to high culture, and the tastes of popular culture were assessed as more direct, sensory, pleasurable and widespread. Let us say for example, visiting to malls. Definitely it is part of the high culture, but in a way it is more directly related to the tastes of people, of space, that space, the music and the air conditioned room, all those accessories that you find, and the shops of varied kind, the escalators, all these things are part of the direct taste of vision, of taste, of sounds. So, that is called popular culture. Let us say visiting or watching movies or becoming a movie buff, or let us say all these what we call the ecology of music, musicology is part of the popular culture. And similarly, you have the mass culture because of mass communication, urbanization. So, reels, TikToks, or all these digital cultures are part of the mass culture. You have money, you have status, you have wealth, you have technology that come into making what is called mass culture or popular culture. Obviously, money is with the high culture also, but then high culture is a kind of like Matthew Arnold was stratifying. The Philistines would be the lowest kind, or the populace would be the lowest kind. High culture is the culture of the people who have more cognitive power for judgment, for deciding what is right and wrong, supposedly. Right? So, cultural studies then looks at these kinds or this stratification of cultures. So, we live not in one culture, but we live in so many kinds of cultures. So, to be exact on the meaning of our context or society or culture, we have to have a cultural approach to these kinds of cultures called high culture, mass culture or popular culture. And indeed, through these keywords, when we understand, we also understand the nature of that culture. So, you do not understand all the malls or all the music or albums, or you do not understand other kinds of performances alike. You understand those things differently. I mean, the social media is full of all these cultures. So, they need to be decoded by organic intellectuals, because the common people cannot understand the dynamics, the politics of TikToks, the politics of reels, or the politics of many other things that are both beneficial and dangerous also for the society. So, similarly, because of this popular culture, you have taste markets as far as food is concerned. There are people who are selling tastes, all kinds of pizza and burger and this cold drinks, many kinds of things, tastes. And then taste communities, like you have reading communities. So, you have taste communities. Look at the categories. I mean, they would like only some kind of tastes. So, you have taste and valuing regimes. So, the state or the government or the institutions would tell you which is good and which is bad. So, taste is also being controlled by the state. So, there is politics of normalizing what is good taste and what is bad taste. So, high cultural tastes, judgment of taste, all these taste here could be food, could be dress, could be fashion, could be computer, could be gadgets, could be education, any other things. How our tastes are being redefined or normalized or controlled by the forces of market and by the state also. So, we need to therefore understand not only culture, but high culture, mass culture, popular culture and others also. So, Next, we will try to understand what is class and working class. And E. P. Thompson defines what is class. He says, class is not a thing which is there, but class is a relationship. Or let us say the rich class and the poor class, or let us say the professors and the students. So, if there is a class or classes of professor and the students, it is because of their relationships. So, class is a word which is a mediator of relationships and meanings between the professors and the students. There is nothing called class out there existing. It is in the process of making. For example, maybe one day the student who is of lower class now would become a higher class when he becomes a professor. So, class therefore is a relationship, it is a fluid state, it is not a thing. And E. P. Thompson talks about an individual becomes a member of a class by playing a social role relevant from the point of view of the authority. So, when a professor says you are a class of people to his students, what he means is that he expects the students or the students themselves have been trained either by RSA, repressive state apparatus, or by ISA, ideological state apparatus, how to behave like students in front of the authority called professors or other things. Similar is the case in factory, similar is the case in a club, similar is the case in military, in hospitals, everywhere. So, it is a social role that people play from the point of view of authority. And one belongs to a class because he occupies a position in a social organization. Class membership is derived from the incumbency of social role. So, that is called class in a fluid state. So, class is a cultural construct. Therefore, cultural studies aims to deconstruct or decode the dialectics of making class. And then he talks about working class. Obviously, working class means, working class is a descriptive term. It ties loosely together a bundle of discrete phenomena. There were tailors, they are a class, weavers, another class, and together, or there could be other classes. So, all these working classes would make what is called working class. All the proletariats or all the marginals, all the workers, they have certain commonalities of experiences and ideologies too. That is how you have Orientalism, or that is how you have subaltern studies, or that is how you have queers. So, that is how we understand class and working class as E. P. Thompson talks about. I will take you to the next slide. So, the next slide is about class consciousness. Class consciousness, according to E. P. Thompson, is the way in class work experiences are handled in cultural terms, embodied in traditions, value systems, ideas and institutional forms. So, what is class consciousness? Experiences of a particular class in a particular class system, and that class system could be a factory, could be an university, could be a club, could be medical, could be any other things, urban, industrial, modern institutions where money is involved. So, these people living in particular class or classes have respective or different consciousness, thoughts, cultures or traditions. So, students as a class have a particular way of behaving, answering, asking. Similarly, professors being another kind of class have different kinds of behaviors, manners or traditions or art of teaching or pedagogy, whatever you say. So, our class consciousness is related to our performances which are within the boundary of that class system. Could be a classroom, could be a factory, as I said, could be any other institutions. So, consciousness of class arises in the same way in different times and places, but never in just the same way. Same way in the sense, I mean, he is talking about one is conscious of one's class, not exactly the same way, or he does not or she does not repeat, or they do not repeat the consciousness like the other students or other professors or other his previous class people did. So, class arises in the same way, but never in just the same way. It keeps on changing. So, for example, students of 1950s had some kind of consciousness, or workers in 1950s had some kind of consciousness, but workers in the 21st century have different kinds of consciousness. So, basically what is referred to here by Thompson is how class or working classes and class consciousness are not rigid categories or concepts or experiences, but they keep on changing with the change of the performers and the performing zones or context. Same university does not remain the same, same teachers or professors do not remain the same. You do not find same factory, though the factory has been there for last 40 years, but it would change. So, with the change of the system, or the class system changes, and the class consciousness also changes. And because they change, therefore, we have to look it from all our senses or intentionalities to decode changes in people's behaviors, people's actions, the structure of the institutions and all. So, these are then particular ways in the sense the most liberal, inclusive, cultural ways of understanding the social problems, anomalies or social events. So, therefore, cultural studies centers on or focuses on the cultural perspective, sociological perspective into culture, into a society. Now, as you can see on your screen, nowadays ethnographic studies are part of many disciplines now. With this emerging culture of cultural studies, ethnography or cultural anthropology becomes, or cultural anthropological sociology, whatever you say, they become part of our cultural studies or our new disciplinary or interdisciplinary or transdisciplinary studies. Now, what is this ethnographic studies? Because this is part of the cultural studies. Now, the ethnographic studies becomes or comes into much discussion with the publication of Alfred Schur's book, 1967 book called The Phenomenology of the Social World. As you can understand, we are talking about phenomenology just a couple of slides before. And Sequerel's book called Method and Measurement in Sociology. And ethnographic study means personal participation. We were talking about organic intellectualism. So, the professors or the students have to go to the people, communicate with them, become a part of their group. That is the way, or these are the methods of ethnographic studies. We are talking about Verrier Elvin, how he would go into the tribal, the indigenous people's society or habitations and stay with them and conduct the research. So, in cultural studies, therefore, you cannot conduct your studies, your researches or your pedagogy within the institutions called classrooms or laboratories or universities or colleges, but you need to, in order to have an ethnographic approach, you have to go into the people, be with them, communicate with them, interview them, and then come back to your institution, your laboratory or classrooms, and try to formulate new theories like the Frankfurt School theories we are doing, or the theories at BCCS we are doing, like Stuart Hall. And in fact, if you remember Richard Hogarth's book called 1957 book called The Uses of Literacy is about the transformation of his colony in Britain. So, it is ethnographic studies is a reawakened interest in the subjective meanings or phenomenological meaning, our intention, our own thoughts, feelings, perceptions, activities. So, therefore, it is sociological phenomenology after the breakdown of the dominance of structural functionalism. For example, I was talking about in my previous lecture how this post-positivism dismantle the positivist structures of learning and research. And ethnographic studies is an outcome of that dismantling or collapse of structuralism or positivist school of research or learning. Ethnographic study is also a growing interest in the methods capable of delivering qualitative knowledge of social relations with all the rich distinctions and tones of living societies. So, it is sociological, it is subjective, it is cultural. These are the parts of ethnographic studies. And ethnographic studies also give us liberty to use documents rather than formulated formulas or prescribed formulas or facts. We use artifacts and records of various kinds to write. And as I was talking about, E.P. Thompson would use diaries, memoirs, letters of the working class people, interviews, and write history. Therefore, his book is called History from Below. I mean, the best feature of his historiography is history from below. Like the subaltern group in India would talk about history of the subalterns. So, this is how ethnographic study is part of the vocabulary of cultural studies. Now, I take you to another slide to talk about the public spheres. So, you see, Jürgen Habermas, who was associated with the Frankfurt School, would talk about public space, and he would define 4 kinds of public spaces, particularly economic sphere, as you can see on your screen, economic sphere, political sphere, social sphere, and cultural sphere, giving us idea that these spheres are not homogeneous, nor are they apolitical, nor are they value neutral, but they have dialogic relationship within themselves and with the people or the subjects who are living in these spheres. And same thing is also repeated almost with one more addition by Arjun Appadurai in his essay. I have given the details in the work cited. Arjun Appadurai talks about ethnoscapes, technoscapes, financescapes, mediascapes, and ideascapes. Obviously, Appadurai is keenly observing about the new developments in the world, how there is flow of people, flow of idea, flow of money, flow of technology. So, we can't look at a space or a society, a country from a very normative given perspective, but we have to decode differences in them, their nature, so that we understand the different emerging people, categories and spaces in order to arrive at a solution, cultural solutions, anthropological solutions, rather than most rigid scientific objective rational solutions, which are basically illusions or temporary or arbitrary. Now, I will take you to the next slide, and we will talk about the media technologies of representations. So, basically we live in a mediascapes now, in the digital age, and our life is controlled or dominated by media culture, and we are perceiving things as they are defined and distributed to us. Marshall McLuhan talks about this in 1950s. And Herbert Marcuse talks about this, Adorno talks about this, that how media representing things that we are supposed to believe. So, they are instrumental in the production, in the distribution and in the consumption of things around us, which can also be called representation. As I was talking about in my previous lecture, you should read Aldous Huxley's essay called Selected Snobberies, how the producers and the advertising agencies, particularly the newspapers, they are together in telling people every morning how they need to update themselves with new things, new gadgets, new items, new artifacts, new objects of modernity. Unless you listen to them, you will be considered as backward and not modern. So, such narratives are constructed by media people through representations of things, and such representations should also be part of the discourse of cultural studies. I mean, you will understand properly or in a better way if you look at these advertisements about perfumes, about dress, about car, about mobiles, very creative advertisements, but those are called the narrative representations of our everyday requirements, everyday demands or wants or things that we need to live with. So, representation, as you can see on your screen, we understand from the philosophical perspective, metaphysical perspective, whether something is true or not, what kind of truth value does this representation have. Another meaning of representation is representation in media and cultural studies. So, this can be metaphysical, abstract, but this is political and full of values, politics. So, therefore, this kind of representation is very much part of our living world, and cultural studies should look into, research into such kind of media representations in order to arrive at a solution. So, probably obesity or kinds of crimes or addiction to such some websites, these could be solved when we decode the politics of representations in social medias, in media in such. And we tend to ask whether such representations are adequate or accurate, but we certainly understand that representations in our times, particularly in media, are a contested zone. The meaning is not accurate, adequate and appropriate, and that is why we are talking about fake news, we are talking about post-truth. People are made to feel forced to believe that this is true. So, it is the medium that determines the message, and we are becoming the passive receivers of such knowledge. We are losing thereby, by being passive, our own judgment, our own cognitive quality. We become slaves of such representations. So, this is how we should look at some of the keywords, and unlike the previous lecture where I was talking about some of the intellectually philosophical concepts in cultural studies in the keyword section part 1, here these are the keywords which are part of the field of cultural studies. We come across such fields like media, like culture, like public space. So, that is how the keywords in this section in lecture 5 are slightly different from the keywords that I have already spoken about in lecture 4. So, with this then we come to the end of this 5th lecture, which was on the keywords of cultural studies part 2, and we also come to the end of the 5 lectures of week 1 of this course called Aspects of Cultural Studies. And before we call it a day, I will show you the works cited, the references which you can follow probably to read further on your own. So, this is the references, and with this I thank you and hope to meet you in the next week with lecture 6. Thank you.